Welcome to Second Take, the show that focuses on the issues behind the news. It is often said that South Africa should expand its manufacturing sector to diversify its economy and create jobs, but the industry remains fragile and confidence levels are low. Terence Creamer joins me to discuss the dilemma. Terence, welcome to Second Take. Manufacturing accounts for something like 15% of the South African economy, but there are already fresh warnings that all is not well.
Yes, manufacturing has really been in decline for a number of decades now, if you really go back into the figures, not just in South Africa, but in Africa. Africa's actually been growing quite strongly over the last decade or so, apart from the period during the global financial crisis. But the share of manufacturing production, or for manufacturing output to that growth, has fallen from about 15% in the 1970 to about 10% now. So you can see we've been on the steady decline in Africa in general, but in South Africa in particular, we've had a steady decline in our manufacturing production, both in terms of output as well as its contribution to the economy. It's now got down to around 15%, 16%. And there are concerns, and I think a bit more organized, vocal concerns about the state of manufacturing and the pace of deindustrialization in this economy. We did have an accelerated deindustrialization post-apartheid because we restructured and opened our economy to the world, and that led to a lot of industries were vulnerable to that because they were based on import substitution. So we did have to drop some of that dead weight, but now there's a view that we really need to rebuild this manufacturing base. And this last week, the Manufacturing Circle put out their second quarterly report, and again they're warning that confidence levels are dipping. We had a strong first quarter, and they're saying that's probably not going to be repeated, and that even though we probably will see output growth relative to the very soft patches during the global recession and the recession that hit South Africa, this is we're not really building a industrial capacity in this country, and it's become more vulnerable because of the rand strength. And the recent violent strike, I think, has also helped to dent manufacturing confidence even further.
A new United Nations report has urged policymakers to revitalize manufacturing. What remedies are being proposed?
Well, I think the main remedy is to have an active industrial policy. Now, that was a sort of a taboo subject during a period during the 90s where people said you can't go into this picking winners type scenario. You need the strategies to really percolate from the bottom and let the market decide. But I think there's a whole lot of new thinking around the world since the global financial crisis, and especially since I think a lot of people have looked back at their economies post-crisis and said, we don't have manufacturing production, and that actually has made us very vulnerable all over the world. But in South Africa too, there's this view that we really need to start re-establishing the manufacturing base. So we've got the new growth path, which puts a lot of emphasis on manufacturing to create the 5 million new direct jobs by 2020. We've got the Industrial Policy Action Plan, which is specifically outlines our industrial strategy, which is a fairly new development. It was something that we avoided for over a decade. So the thrust of the report is say you need an active industrial policy to start rebuilding South Africa and South Africa's manufacturing base. But they do warn that we can't go through the old picking winners scenario where you do have to prioritize, but you do need to put time horizons onto these things so that you don't just create these uncompetitive laggard industries that actually are a drain on that society rather than actually a benefit to that society. So we have to do it differently to the way we did in the past, but we can't allow Africa and South Africa's industrial capacity to continue to decline. It's already only 1.1% of global manufacturing output.
The World Bank also added its voice in a recent update where it explores the Southern Africa factory concept. What does it mean by this?
Well, I think they've really looked at it as the World Bank and saying, again, we need to re-establish manufacturing in South Africa. They did the inaugural South Africa update, which I think they're going to do twice a year. And this update raised a lot of concerns about savings rates, low investment rates. Even though returns are fairly high in South Africa, they're warning that, there's a number of constraints to people taking advantage of those high returns. And there's barriers to entry, and there's the saving constraint, and there's a whole lot of labour concerns as well. But I think that there was an interesting part or a subsection to that report, basically saying that South Africa needs to build new global linkages to build its manufacturing base. And one of the concepts was this Factory Southern Africa, which is modelled on Factory Asia. And when they analyse it, they really say, look, yes, tariffs have come down in the region, but that's really not good enough. So we've got SACU, which is the oldest customs union in the world. We've got SADC, which is really moving towards a free trade agreement. We've got this tripartite free trade area, which is going to take a free trade area potentially from Cape to Cairo, involving now 27 countries, now that we've got South Sudan in the mix probably, because they'll join one of those blocks. So it was 26 countries, it will be 27 countries once it comes to fruition, possibly in 2013. But they're saying that's not really, it's important, it's a necessary condition, but it's not going to be sufficient to take us to that next level. And what Factory Asia did was to say, what are the comparative advantages of the different countries within a region? And they started setting up supply chains across the region. So you had where they were labour rich, you tapped into that advantage. Where they were resource rich, they tapped into that. Where they were skills rich, they tapped into that. So Japan sustained certain things, while Vietnam and China and others did other things. So the basic proposal is that we need to look at this Factory Southern Africa concept, looking beyond our national borders, and really it's going to hinge materially on really beefing up our logistics north-south. So we've always had west-east logistic infrastructure basically built around colonial trade patterns where we really exported agricultural and mining products to the developed markets. But they're saying we now need linkages north-south and to try and really boost intra-regional trade, not just inter-regional trade, but intra-regional trade to a point, hopefully, that Asia has got, which is the highest in the world. Unfortunately, there's a long, long way to go because we are currently the lowest intra-regional traders in the world.
Terence, are the transmission mechanisms in place in South Africa to help realise the political aspirations for reindustrialisation?
I think that's the key question. I think that the political will is there, the political desire is there, the aspiration is there to rebuild manufacturing, but you're not seeing it on the factory floor. In fact, going right back to the first question, actually confidence is very fragile, very brittle. People are saying we've really been in structural decline for so many years. This is not just a short-term blip downwards. We really need to arrest this because we're getting to a point that the warning signs are that we're hitting a tipping point where we can really get to a point where we have massive deindustrialization unless we start rebuilding. Now, obviously, if you speak to manufacturers, the obvious transmission mechanism for them, it's a no-brainer, is weaken the rand. Now, there's ways you can do it, but I think it's a very difficult strategy to adopt for the South African government because there are competing priorities. You know, you've got inflation on the one hand, you've got massive import components to your economy, especially because we've got this very, very large infrastructure backlog, a good portion of which is going to rely on importation to rebuild. So it's a very difficult equation to balance. And the other problem is the rand is highly traded and highly liquid. And we've got active policies in countries like the US to weaken their currencies, quantitative easing 1, 2, and now there's talk of 3. You know, the Eurozone muddle has really, the political muddle around the Eurozone and the sovereign debt crisis has served to weaken that euro. So there are external factors that are really outside of our control. So, but if you speak to a manufacturer, that is the silver bullet. You know, weaken this rand and we'll start raising output. But I think we do have to take that seriously. And we have to look at ways, and I think the Reserve Bank has already got a mandate to boost their reserve holdings, which they are doing. Maybe some other creative mechanisms, you know, that Brazil and India and others are doing. One that's a possibility is the formation of a sovereign wealth fund where you sequester or you set aside and ring fence a certain portion of your foreign exchange reserve, specifically for projects outside the country. So that money won't be used internally. It will help weaken the rand potentially. And I think there might be virtue to the Southern Africa factory concept here in the sense that you could maybe sequester that money and set it aside specifically for north-south logistics as well as power generation projects in the region, which could help our manufacturers. One, it creates a new market into which to supply immediately, but it also creates some critical mass for manufacturers, you know, because you've got not just this local market and the infrastructure inputs into that, but the infrastructure inputs of possibly the Cape to Cairo type concept, especially if you exploit the rules of origin benefits within that fully. So I think there's some thought is going into this RAND issue and sovereign wealth fund issue, and I think we do need to pay some attention to that. But I also think we have to just get this region cooperating a lot better. Regional integration, I think, has got a lot of long-term potential benefits for manufacturing. And yes, I think we need to start seeing real action around some of these programs. We hear about localization, local content around Eskom and Transnet, but we want to actually see them. We want to see factories going up around those programs. And until we do, I think confidence is going to remain brittle, and I think there's going to be a high degree of skepticism about whether the policies are going to be translated into action.
Terence, thank you very much. That is the Second Take show for this week. Thank you for watching, and join us again next time for more news analysis.